I built the workshop with my own hands. Every beam, every joint, every square foot of it. I was 53 years old when I drove the last nail into the roof, and I stood back in the October cold and looked at what I had made, and I did not say a word. Some things don't need words. My name is Harold. I spent 31 years working as a licensed electrician in Ontario, mostly commercial jobs, schools, municipal buildings, a few hospitals. I started my apprenticeship at 19, got my certificate of qualification at 23, and I worked every winter and every summer until I retired at 54 with a pension from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and enough savings to live quietly without worry. My wife Margaret and I had built our property in Lanark County over 20 years, 4.5 acres off a gravel road outside of Perth, Ontario, a modest 2-story house, a vegetable garden that Margaret tended from April to October, and the workshop where I spent most of my retired mornings. We were not wealthy people. We were comfortable people, which in my experience is better. We had 2 children. Our son Raymond was 51. Our daughter Susan was 46. Raymond had lived in Edmonton for 20 years, working in pipeline logistics. He called every few weeks, visited at Christmas when he could manage it, and never once asked us about money or property. Susan lived 40 minutes away in Smiths Falls with her husband Gary. Gary sold commercial insurance. He was the kind of man who laughed loudly at his own jokes and always seemed to be calculating something behind his eyes. Margaret had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 2 years before any of this happened. Her symptoms were manageable, some tremor in her left hand, occasional balance issues, but the diagnosis had frightened her in a way I understood completely. She was 67 years old, and she had watched her own mother decline from the same disease over 8 years. The fear was reasonable. I did not try to talk her out of it. I just made sure she knew I was not going anywhere. Susan began calling more frequently after the diagnosis. At first, I was grateful. A father wants to believe his daughter is calling out of love. She would ask about Margaret's medications, her appointments at the Kingston Neurology Clinic, whether we had thought about what would happen to the property if Margaret's condition worsened. I told her we had a lawyer. I told her everything was organized. She would say, of course, and change the subject to something lighter, and I would hang up the phone feeling vaguely uneasy without being able to name why. Gary started coming around with Susan on Sunday visits. He would walk through the workshop with his hands in his pockets, nodding at the tools, asking what things were worth. He asked me once very casually whether I had ever thought about putting the property in a family trust. I told him I had looked into it. He said his brother-in-law had done something similar, and it had saved the family a significant amount in probate. I said that was interesting and offered him coffee. He accepted the coffee and kept talking about the brother-in-law. The property was worth considerably more than when we bought it. Land prices in Lanark County had climbed steadily over the previous decade, and we were sitting on 4.5 acres with a well, a septic system, a solid house, and a workshop I had built to last 100 years. I was aware of the value. I had not spent 31 years as a licensed tradesman without learning something about the cost of things. What Gary did not know, and what Susan did not know, was that I had spent 3 months the previous winter working with a lawyer in Perth to restructure our estate into a spousal trust. Margaret was the primary beneficiary. Raymond and Susan were named as secondary beneficiaries in equal shares, with specific conditions attached to Susan's portion related to the timing and manner of any property transfer. I had done this quietly, without telling either of them, because I trusted Raymond completely, and because something about Gary's questions had been sitting badly with me for months. Margaret knew we had done something with the estate documents. She did not know the specifics because she had been in the middle of adjusting a new medication, and I had not wanted to add to her stress. I told her I would explain everything once she was settled. She told me she trusted me. She had told me that for 43 years, and she had never once been wrong to do it. In March, Susan called and asked if she and Gary could come for a long weekend. She said she wanted to spend time with her mother. I said, of course. Margaret was pleased. She baked a butter tart square the afternoon before they arrived, which had been Susan's favorite since she was a child. They arrived on a Friday evening. Dinner was pleasant enough. Gary had brought a bottle of Ontario Red from Prince Edward County, which I thought was a reasonable gesture. We talked about Margaret's last appointment, about Raymond's kids, about the ice that had come late that year and the mud it had left behind on the driveway. Susan held her mother's hand across the table at one point, and I watched Margaret smile, and I thought, maybe I had misjudged this. Saturday morning, Gary asked if I would show him the workshop. I took him out after breakfast. He walked around the perimeter slowly, looked at the insulation I had done on the north wall, asked about the electrical panel I had installed. Then he said, very evenly, that he had been talking to a real estate contact in Perth, and properties like ours were moving quickly right now. He said some of them were going to developers who were building rural subdivisions. He said the timing was interesting. I said I was sure it was, and handed him a hammer to hold while I adjusted a vise. Sunday is when it happened. Margaret and I had gone down to the cold cellar after lunch to bring up some preserves she had put up the previous fall: tomatoes, bread and butter pickles, a few jars of apple butter. The cold cellar was built into the north foundation of the workshop, accessible through a heavy wooden door from inside. It was 8 feet deep, lined with shelving, properly ventilated, and insulated well enough to keep root vegetables through February. I had built it the same year I built the workshop. Susan came to the top of the stairs and said she needed to show us something. Could we come up? We said we'd be right there. Then we heard the door close. Then we heard the bolt slide. Margaret looked at me. I looked at the door. There was a moment of complete silence. Then Gary's voice came through the door, muffled but clear enough. He said that he and Susan just needed a few hours. He said there were some documents on the workbench upstairs, and that if I would agree to sign them, we could all move forward like adults. He said the property transfer would be registered to Susan's name for now, for tax purposes, and that of course Margaret and I would continue living there. He said it was the sensible arrangement given Margaret's situation. He said if we hadn't signed by morning, we could discuss it further then. Then it went quiet. Margaret had gone very still. She was gripping the shelf beside her, and I could see the tremor in her left hand was worse than usual. Her face was pale. I put my hand on her arm and I said quietly, steadily, "Don't panic. They don't know what I put in this wall." She looked at me. 4 years earlier, when I was finishing the cold cellar, I had installed a recessed compartment behind a false panel on the east wall, between 2 floor joists, about 18 inches above ground level. I had done it the way I did most things, methodically, without announcing it to anyone. A tradesman builds redundancy into his work. He plans for failure. He does not assume the first exit will always be available. Inside the compartment, I had placed a waterproof box. Inside the box was a charged backup battery phone, a simple device, pay-as-you-go, that I replaced every 18 months, a folded copy of our property deed, the trust documents from our lawyer, and a single sheet of paper with the direct line to our lawyer's office and the non-emergency number for the Lanark County OPP detachment. I pressed the lower left corner of a specific board on the east wall. The panel swung inward on a piano hinge. I reached in and took out the box. Margaret watched me open it. She looked at the phone, then at the documents, then at me. She said quietly, "How long have you had that in there?" I said 4 years. She sat down on an overturned crate and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I always thought you were just very careful." I said I was very careful. I called 911 first. I told the dispatcher my name, my address, that my wife and I had been locked in a basement room of our property by our daughter and her husband, who were upstairs attempting to obtain a fraudulent property transfer by confinement. I used those exact words because I had looked them up years ago just to know them. The dispatcher told me units would be en route and asked me to stay on the line. I gave the phone to Margaret and asked her to keep talking to the dispatcher while I unfolded the trust documents. I had read those documents many times. I knew what they said, but I wanted to hold them while I waited, because it helped to hold something solid. The OPP arrived in 22 minutes. I know because I was watching the time. We heard the knock at the workshop door, heard Gary say something, heard the knock again, and then the announcement, "Ontario Provincial Police, open the door." The bolt slid back 4 minutes later. The door opened and there was a constable at the top of the stairs, a young woman who looked down at us and said, "Sir, are you Harold Briggs?" I said I was. She said, "Can you come upstairs, please?" We came upstairs. Gary was standing near the workbench with his arms crossed, talking in a very controlled voice about a misunderstanding. Susan was standing by the side door with her coat already on, not looking at her mother. There was a stack of papers on the workbench, a property transfer form, partially filled out, with my name printed at the top in Gary's handwriting. There was a pen laid across it. The constable looked at the papers. She looked at me. I put the trust documents on the bench beside the transfer form and said that our property had been placed in a spousal trust registered with the Land Registry Office in Perth the previous January, that the trust made any unilateral transfer without Margaret's written consent and my lawyer's verification legally void, and that I had a copy of the trust registration number if she needed it. I read the number from the document. Gary said that was not something he had been made aware of. I said that I was aware of that. The constable asked Gary and Susan to remain where they were. A second unit arrived within a few minutes. I sat with Margaret at the small table I kept in the corner of the workshop, the one where I drank my morning coffee, and I poured her a glass of water from the bottle on the shelf, and I held her hand while the officers spoke with Gary and Susan on the other side of the building. Susan did not look at us for a long time. When she finally turned and our eyes met, she looked like a person who had just understood something about herself that she had not wanted to understand. I did not feel satisfaction about that. I felt something closer to grief, which surprised me. She was my daughter. She had eaten at our table every Sunday of her childhood. She had sat with Margaret in the hospital in 2019 and held her hand. Whatever Gary had planned, whatever he had convinced her was reasonable, she had gone along with it. She had slid the bolt. Gary and Susan were both charged that evening. Gary was charged with unlawful confinement under Section 279 of the Criminal Code of Canada and with attempted fraud. Susan was charged with unlawful confinement as a party to the offense. I want to be clear about that because I know what the question will be. Yes, Susan was charged. She was not a bystander. She knew where we were and she helped keep us there. The system did not treat her as innocent because she was my daughter, and I would not have wanted it to. I called Raymond that night from the kitchen while Margaret slept. It was late in Edmonton, past 11. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened, plainly and in order. He was quiet for most of it. When I finished, he said, "Dad, I need to come there." I told him he didn't need to come right away, that we were physically fine. He said he was booking a flight anyway. He arrived Tuesday afternoon and he hugged his mother for a long time in the front hallway and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. People have asked me since why I didn't tell Margaret about the compartment, about the phone, about the documents. The honest answer is that I wanted her to sleep at night. Margaret was managing a diagnosis that frightened her. I did not want her spending energy worrying about a contingency I had already prepared for. A tradesman does not leave a junction box open because the wiring is probably fine. He closes it because it might not be. I had closed the box. There was no reason for her to think about it until she needed to. But I also think, and I have spent some time with this, that there was something I needed to do quietly and alone, without discussion or approval. I had spent 31 years doing work that people trusted me to do correctly the first time, in walls they couldn't see into, behind panels they couldn't open. The trust I put in that cold cellar wall was the same kind of work. Done right, done without announcement, designed to be found only when it was needed. I was not keeping a secret from Margaret. I was keeping a promise to her that she didn't know I had made. The trial took 14 months. Gary's lawyer negotiated hard, but the confinement charge held. He was convicted of unlawful confinement and criminal fraud and sentenced to 18 months in custody, plus 2 years probation. Susan received a conditional discharge with 2 years probation, mandatory counseling, and 150 hours of community service. The conditional discharge was not what I had hoped for, and I will not pretend otherwise. But her criminal record will reflect the conviction for the duration of her probation, and the discharge was conditional on completing every requirement. She has, from what I understand, been complying. Margaret wrote Susan a letter 6 months after the sentencing. I did not read it before she sent it. She told me afterward that she had written what she needed to write, and that she felt better having written it. She told me Susan had not replied. I said that was Susan's choice to make. Margaret said, yes, and sat with it quietly the way she sits with most hard things, not easily, but fully. We are still on the property. Margaret's condition has progressed some in the past year. Her left side is noticeably weaker, and she has a walker she uses when the ground is uneven. But she was in the garden last September, kneeling in the dirt with gloves on, pulling carrots that had grown thick and crooked and very good. I watched her from the workshop doorway, and I thought about how many times I had watched her from that same spot, over how many years, in how many different kinds of light. Raymond calls every week now. Sometimes he calls twice. He spent 2 weeks here last summer helping me re-roof one section of the workshop that had started to show wear. He is not a tradesman, he is a logistics man. Careful and organized, but he works hard and he asks good questions, and he does not pretend to know something he doesn't. We worked well together. We still do. The compartment in the cold cellar wall is still there. I replaced the phone battery last November, updated the documents after we amended the trust last spring. I will replace it again in 18 months. I see no reason to stop. Some things, once you have built them, you simply maintain.